Emotions Matter. Brought to you by emaw.com. That's EMAWW.com. Your solution for emotional intelligence. We are fortunate to have with us the author of the #1 best-selling international title, 7 Steps to Spiritual Empathy, Jenny Florence. You'll also find Jenny's writings on The Huffington Post, where her blog offers guidance on topics from emotional meditation to how having the right to choose keeps us healthy. Jenny has worked as a counselor and therapist for over 25 years, having trained in a variety of therapeutic modalities. Drawing on her extensive experience as a therapist, Jenny's writings are a journey of self-awareness, connecting the intelligence and creative capacity of our mind with emotional knowledge and understanding. Welcome, Jenny. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, John. I'm delighted to be here. It's a joy to be having this conversation.
Terrific. Give our guests some background into your life's journey and how it sort of manifested into your career in therapy.
Well, John, I've had a really interesting life. As a young person, I actually really struggled emotionally. I was incredibly shy and I was bullied at school. I was painfully shy, in fact. And I ended up suffering from periods of childhood depression, although I didn't really understand them to be that at the time. And it wasn't that my mum and dad were kind of difficult people. My dad didn't know how to handle the fact that I wasn't okay. He used to kind of get angry and cross about it. My mum did everything she could, but she hadn't been brought up in a particularly emotionally aware environment, so she didn't really know how to connect to the challenges that I was facing. So all in all, as a family, we weren't really managing our emotions particularly well. And then when I grew up into my sort of adult life, my early adult life, I found myself engaging in what I would now consider to be quite unhealthy relationships. I just really didn't know how to navigate relationships. And of course, relationships are about emotions. They're not about thought. Our relationships and being able to connect and engage with other people, to learn to love other people, is all about emotion. And I guess I hadn't really learned to navigate my emotions particularly well. And that, in the end, actually is what sort of brought me into a career in counseling and in therapy. I think I wanted to learn and to know more. So that was the beginning of my journey. And along the way, of course, that just became a journey of self-discovery, of personal therapy. And I think one of the key turning points for me was in recognizing that when I learned to understand what my emotions were about, and I learned to relate to all of the emotional experiences that I was having, I could begin to take full responsibility in any situation I found myself in. My relationships were improving, they were flourishing. I was able to navigate life in such a different way. And so really that's really began to fuel a very different take on emotional health, and that began to underpin a very different way of working with my clients in therapy.
So Jenny, I'm curious. You're from the UK. Do you find that, let's call it emotional intelligence or emotional awareness, do you believe that is cultural? Is there a cultural difference between, say, your U.S. clients and or UK-based, or if you deal with people in Australia or Spain or someplace else? Is there a cultural difference in the way people understand and relate to emotions?
That's a very interesting question, John, because I think in England we do have a slightly what I would call stiff upper lip kind of attitude towards emotions historically. But emotional health, I think, has become increasingly important. We're becoming more aware of how important it is. We tend to look, I think, at mental health rather than emotional health. In reality, mental health tends to describe different states of being. And in my experience, to be honest, regardless of where you come from, if you don't have a fluent emotional language and you're not really sure how to navigate your emotions, you are going to end up getting into an emotional pickle at some point or another. So, yeah, I think maybe my connections in the States would lead me to believe that there's a movement that has a greater awareness of emotional well-being in the States. I think you maybe are a little bit ahead of us in some ways. And yet in other ways, I think I also notice that I think in the UK, certainly in the therapeutic world, we really look at things at depth. You know, we don't sit at a superficial level of awareness. We look much deeper. So in many ways, I think there's a greater openness in the States. And yet I think the greater depth of understanding often comes from our kind of UK therapeutic understanding.
So you've written on topics related to gaining power over the emotional marks that take place during our lives. Give our listeners a brief tour of working through a traumatic event which may have marked someone with extreme fear or anxiety or potentially a phobia.
It's quite an interesting question, this one, John, because I think it's quite difficult to talk briefly about how to work through trauma. But there are various key points, I think, in recovery from trauma that are really, really worth just voicing. I mean, firstly, any kind of trauma, we must always look at the individual person. Anything that any of us go through, we are individuals and different people will respond differently to different situations. But as a general rule of thumb, if we consider that trauma is the result of an experience where we go into a state of extreme shock, we are terrified, we're afraid, it's an experience that is ultimately out of our control and we're helpless to do anything about it. And so we are inevitably, if we experience trauma, going to go through some pretty challenging emotions in response to that. If we can't process that emotional experience, it kind of leaves us with a residue. And that residue will continue to surface until we attend to it. I think one of the biggest and most important starting points in anyone that's been traumatized by any situation is to recognize that the emotions that they're feeling are actually quite a normal response. Mm-hmm. So even if we're experiencing extreme fear or extreme anxiety as a result of trauma, that means that we're having a normal emotional response to an abnormal situation. Yeah, so we've got a healthy emotional response to an unhealthy situation. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very important that we kind of begin to normalize that experience. Otherwise, what tends to happen is that people become frightened of the way that they're feeling. Mm-hmm. So if I'm, say, feeling fearful because I've experienced a trauma of some sort, I then become fearful of that feeling. And when we do that, we're literally kind of adding a greater amount of fear to the way that we're already feeling. Mm-hmm. You know, if we become fearful of fear, we've just doubled the emotional load. Right. And the moment we do that, we can begin to slightly dissipate and turn the volume down on the sort of residue of that traumatic experience. Mm-hmm. We then really need to give ourselves or give that person permission to listen and to remove judgment. It's extraordinary, I think. I mean, if you think about our conversation right now, if a child were to come into this conversation now and they had experienced something traumatic and they were distressed or unhappy or fearful, we wouldn't tell them how stupid they are. Mm-hmm. You know, we'd be really supportive. We'd be encouraging them to talk. We'd be saying, look, of course you feel this way. You know, that's completely understandable. And yet most of us, if we experience challenging emotions, we tend to get really, really critical of ourselves. We tell ourselves how stupid we are. We should put that down. What's wrong with us? You know, get on with it. All this kind of stuff. So we tend to have a dialogue that's incredibly critical of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't offer that to someone else. And yet we kind of engage in this sort of inner slaughter sometimes. And people who've been traumatized are often very, very critical of the way they're dealing with it. And so we really need to remove that judgment and remove that criticism. That's kind of the second key point. The next stage really in beginning to help someone recover from trauma is to help them to re-engage with choice. Because a trauma is something that's out of our control. So we've lost our capacity to have choice. So when we start to re-engage with choices, and we re-engage with, it doesn't matter how small the choice is or how big it is, or even if we begin to recognize that the choices we would like aren't the ones that are available to us, but we still have choice. The moment we re-engage with choice, we begin to turn the volume down on that sense of everything being out of our control. And in doing that, we can start to begin to feel as though we're on solid ground again. So working with choices is a really key element to recovery from trauma. And I think one of the final and key points is that we, through re-engaging with choice, we can begin to re-establish some kind of relationship to trust. Because when we are in the throes of trauma or the aftermath of trauma, we lose trust in the world, we lose trust in people, we begin to see threat everywhere. And it's very, very important to establish some sense of trust. So again, another element of that is that we need to do this with others, whether we engage in a group or with somebody. Trust isn't established in isolation. We need to begin to find the courage and give ourselves permission to seek help in whatever way we can. So those are kind of the key elements, I think, to moving through and beginning to work through and process the aftermath of a traumatic event.
So let me ask you something, Jenny. What have you found to be the most challenging emotion to provide therapy for?
This is interesting because I think I would have to say despair. It's curious because I'm just finishing my next book where I actually tackle all of our most challenging emotions and really help people to understand how to use them as an asset rather than a disability. But despair is a kind of a meltdown. It's the point of no return for a lot of people, and it's the point of their greatest vulnerability. When we reach a point of despair, it's often an amalgamation of lots of other challenging emotions that we haven't been able to attend to. So we've lost sight of hope, we've lost sight of possibility, we struggle to see a way forwards, we start to move into a place of futility, pointlessness, and we tend to withdraw. And despair can really be compounded by loneliness, isolation. So for me, that's one of the greatest and most challenging emotions to provide therapy for, because we need to be able to shift somebody to a place where, however desperate they're feeling or however overwhelmed they may be feeling, they can begin to recognize that there is the possibility of change.
So in response to that, diving a little deeper into despair, do you find that there is an age differential? Do you find that certain age groups experience more despair than others, or is it universal?
Curiously enough, I actually think it's universal. However, what's really interesting is that I notice that people often, if something isn't right in their lives, but they're maybe just ticking over, they're kind of surviving rather than living, we often see a kind of a build-up over time. I mean, despair tends not to come from a one-off event. It can do. If something happens that's so out of our control or that really tips us over the edge, we can experience that space of despair. But as a general rule, despair tends to build up over time. It's usually an amalgamation, as I've said, of emotions that are not being attended to. And I've noticed, I call them the big O's. When people approach what I would call the sort of the 30, the 40, the 50, the 60, it's the big O's. At 20, we tend to be looking ahead, at life. We see lots of possibility. At 30, the despair sometimes is, will I meet the right person? Will I have a family? There are key issues that tend to come up. And if they've been particularly challenging for someone over a period of time, it's at the big O's, at those kind of anniversaries, that it almost calls people up and gets them to kind of look at themselves. Mm-hmm. And if there's an ongoing issue that they haven't been able to attend to, that might lead them into a state of despair, that will be the sort of the key point. So as I said, it is universal, but there seems to me to be very often these kind of key stages. I call them the big O's. Mm-hmm. People do their reevaluation at those points. It's almost like it's a marking of time, and they're kind of either looking forwards or looking backwards, or wondering what's going wrong or what they can do, or indeed feeling that they can't do something.
So your experiences have been with people up to this point and through your life. Do you notice anything different about the millennial generation? Do they approach these things differently than you've noticed other generations in the past?
I think one of the biggest challenges that they face as a generation is that they are bombarded with information constantly. If I was to look back to, say, my grandmother's generation and the amount of information coming through, it was so minimal compared to now. So young people are bombarded with information. They're also bombarded with choices without a lot of definition. So I think we're in a really interesting period in time. We're defining what it is to be in relationship in a very different way. Relationships and marriages are no longer defined by economic circumstances or by having families or, we have a whole different set of criteria without any real guidelines. So I think the millennium generation are facing lots and lots of challenges because there's so much opportunity and yet there is so much overwhelming choice with such a huge amount of information that they've got to sift through. And all of these things trigger emotional responses. But they still aren't necessarily being raised from a background of a huge amount of emotional awareness. Emotional awareness and emotional language, emotional literacy is relatively new. So although we are learning about it and we're developing it and we're understanding it and we're putting it out there more and more, lots and lots of people have grown up in families where there was a lack of emotional awareness, and not because our parents wanted to parent us badly, but because they weren't brought up with that either. So as I said, I think there's this huge amount of information coming through with a lack of the skills to process it from an emotional point of view.
Does that also become reflected in the new generation being, let's call it, less connected physically to other people? Most of the current generation interacts with other people electronically, virtually, versus an in-person sort of interaction. Does that have a negative or positive? I mean, what is your belief on the effect that has on people and their ability to process emotions?
Curiously enough, I think there are positives and negatives, and that would be my experience of the world that we're living in so far. In some ways, I think the danger is that engaging, via technology, people lose relational skills, or they don't even develop those relational skills. So, and we can hide behind a screen. We can have an avatar. We don't have to be honest necessarily with people about who we are. So there's a whole kind of almost like a danger area there. On the other hand, I think that when people are struggling emotionally, it's an incredible challenge to face up to those challenges and share them with somebody. And that's, part of being human. So one of the things that I've noticed with technology is that people can actually, if they are struggling, sometimes find a group of people that they can connect to, and they can find like-minded people or people who are struggling with similar problems. And so it reduces their sense of aloneness. And even in the therapeutic world, I've noticed that there are maybe people coming through that would not have had the courage to walk through a therapist's door and sit face to face with somebody because they feel so vulnerable. But by initiating a relationship online, they can start that process. And that allows them to then begin to build a relationship that will give them the courage to take something further. So I think it swings in roundabouts, and we can see positives and negatives. It works in both ways.
Terrific. That's, again, very insightful. I would not have taken both sides of the perspective. I would have expected, me personally, having been a people manager over the years, I would have thought to myself that my emotions online, well, while they can be, let's call them, more blatant, without the reprisal of someone being in your face and, looking at you and you see their actual physicality of their emotions. Online that you don't see any of that. So there's quite a difference there.
What you have just been saying is incredibly insightful, I think, about the fact that people are not meeting face to face, and just the experience of the online connections, lacking in emotional responsiveness.
Hmm.
I really wanted to add to that, actually, because something that I think is lacking, or I'm noticing the lack of it in these sort of online interactions in a more global way, is a lack of respect.
Hmm.
And, when you were just speaking and saying about the way that, people, there's less repercussion because you're not sitting with someone. And that is something that I think we need really, really to embrace in terms of, how do we address this? Because in many ways, there are so many emotional problems that result from a lack of respect within real relationship. It's really present in the online scene as well.
Hmm.
And I think what my view of life, generally speaking, is, when we identify a problem, we can begin to look to find the solutions. And so, just as you were speaking, it really highlighted that issue for me, because I had a conversation with a young person not long ago, and she just said, I am getting sick and tired of the lack of respect shown in the engaging that I see between people, say, on Facebook and on some of the other social media sites.
Hmm.
And I thought to myself, yes, absolutely, you're identifying a problem here. We need to, I think, help to teach people to relate with respect, whether that is in person or online. I think we need to be generating something of that across the board. Just because, again, look at the whole global world as we stand, there's a huge lack of respect within the sort of problems that humanity faces.
Hmm.
So I think there's some really big issues here. We can see them, on a global scale. We can also see them in the one-to-one interactions with people. And as I said, I think the more we see things and the more we identify problems, we can look to finding solutions. So I'm very big on actually thinking, gosh, actually you've pinpointed that. Let's think about what we can do with that.
Well, thank you for that. Let's dive in a little deeper then. So the book introduces the concept of relatedness and having a relational connection with life. So walk our listeners through this transformational practice.
For sure, I'd love to. Thank you, John. Now, it's really interesting with the book, which is called The 7 Steps to Spiritual Empathy. I debated a great deal about what to call it, what title to choose, because ultimately what I've identified is 7 core relational skills that will allow us to embrace and lead a life of integrity, which really connects to what we were just speaking about, the need to actually build respect into our relationships as one of our core relational skills, whether that's online or within the immediacy of our relationships in our everyday world. What I've literally done is understood empathy as a relational skill. It's not just a skill that we can learn when we sort of teach ourselves to sit with somebody and focus with our mind on what they're saying. I understand empathy as being an empathic response to people's emotional states. And for someone to sit safely and share their emotions with us, they need to know that we're going to be respectful. They need to know that we are available to receive them without any form of judgment. So this book is about cultivating those core relational skills, cultivating our ability to be present to someone, to really listen and hear, to become mindful of both them as well as ourselves, to develop respect and the recognition of the impact of our actions, and really to build all of these skills into our ongoing relationships in every way. So when I talk about listening to life, I'm really talking about a respect for life itself, for other people, for our environment, for the world around us, really embracing empathy as a key skill for living well.
So your book does speak about having a basis in emotional empathy. Why don't you give our listeners your thoughts on the relationship between empathy and, say, the emotion of love?
Well, I'd love to tell you a story about how this kind of emerged for me. When I did my first ever counselling training course, which was a long, long time ago, it must be about 26 or 27 years ago, when I finished it, I embarked on another training, and it was a 1-year observation, an infant observation course. Do you know, it was one of the most life-changing experiences that I've ever had, totally unexpectedly. I thought I'd just be going to observe this baby once a week, see the average developmental impact of the first year of life. The first meeting that I had with the baby that I was going to observe was one of the most moving experiences that I have ever had. Basically, this baby was born early, over a month early, and so he was in a premature baby unit in an incubator. And the mum, who I'd made arrangements to be able to visit her once a week for a year, she called me up and she explained what had happened, that the baby was early. And she said, would you like to come and see him? So I came into the baby unit. She pointed out where he was. He was in an incubator. And she went off to talk to one of the nurses. And so I wandered over and I sat down and I just watched him. He was absolutely minute, too tiny for her to even be able to take out of the incubator and cuddle. He was too vulnerable. And he was wired up to all of these monitors. And you could see his heart rate and his breathing. Everything was there. And as I was sitting there just watching, his mum came over and she sat down and she just started to speak, to tell me what had happened and the story of how, he'd arrived a month early. Mm. The moment she started to speak, his heart rate increased, and he moved from a deep sleep into a dream sleep. All the monitors changed, and he was listening to her. It was quite extraordinary. I cannot tell you how this was. It was just so moving, because he started to murmur, and while she was talking to me, she murmured back. She had no idea she was even doing this. It was completely instinctual. They had this extraordinary connection despite all these obstacles. Every time he murmured, in between her conversation with me, she mirrored his murmuring. And it was just, you could see that they had this profound connection, even though he was so small and so vulnerable, she couldn't even pick him up. And I was absolutely mesmerized. And every time she went away, he moved into a deep sleep again and stopped. And every time she came back and started talking, it happened again. And I just thought, wow, this is incredible. This is a pure relational connection. I mean, this is pure empathy. And this is pure love, love in its purest sense. It's not about the love where we attach loads of conditions and all the things that we want in a relationship and what love means. There was a purity in this relational exchange. And I've never forgotten that, because to my mind, that really helped me to understand that empathy is about a relational connection through love. It's not about a process that takes place in our mind. It's really about our ability to be available for that connection, regardless of circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so when I talk about being able to develop this kind of level of connectedness to life itself, I'm really talking about being able to live from a position of pure relational love in every possible way. We can overcome so much if we're able to live in this way. There are so many problems that we face in the world that come down to an inability to simply connect and be available in a respectful and responsive manner with others. When we get back to the purity of that kind of exchange, life just simply feels different. So as I said, that's really where the roots of this came from all that time ago.
So getting you to that state, through your website, you offer daily meditations on the A to Z of emotional health website. What meditative therapy would be helpful for someone who's experienced extreme grief or depression, or wants to move into a more empathetic emotional state?
Yeah, well, the meditations on the A to Z of emotional health, or A to Z of emotional health, as you call it. This is my library. It's an emotional health library. It's full of audios. It's going to be launched soon as a free public resource. It's been a membership site, but we are going to just put this stuff out there. I have made a commitment to really wanting to make a contribution to making a difference in the world. Now, the section of meditations are what I have called emotional meditation. And they are very relevant for all kinds of emotional challenges and all kinds of emotional difficulties that people are experiencing, or as you said, just if people want to begin to develop their capacity to be more in tune with their inner voice and their emotional kind of experience of life. So emotional meditation came about because I actually had an incredibly challenging year a few years ago, and I lost 7 people in 1 year. That's a lot of loss. That's a lot of bereavement.
Wow.
And yeah, absolutely. Wow. And I found myself, I mean, I'm a pretty emotionally aware person as people go. It's my job. It's who I am as a human being. I've really embarked on that journey of self-discovery. But I began to really feel as though I wasn't on solid ground. And so I thought to myself, right, I need more than just emotional awareness here. You know, I have lots of support around me. I need to do more because, you know, I'm feeling very, very wobbly. So I decided that I would take up meditation, and I went online and I downloaded, you know, there's loads of stuff out there. I downloaded various meditations. And as I started to meditate, all of these emotions were just coming to the surface. And I realized how much I was carrying around inside me. I mean, I was really on an emotional overload, managing really well in my daily life because that's natural for me. It's what I do. Because I'm not fearful of my emotions, I just allowed them to surface. I just went with it. And I just allowed myself to release all of this emotional tension that I was carrying. And by the time I got to the end of the meditation, I was ready to meditate. It was, and I kind of thought, right, this is crazy. You know, I need a sort of a double meditation here. I need a period in which I can kind of release all my emotions that's kind of contained and safe, because I was meditating in a really nice private kind of space. So, you know, my emotional vulnerability could surface without any fear or anxiety. Mm-hmm. But I then wanted to kind of move into the meditation. So I kind of like listened to it again. And I thought to myself, you know, maybe I could develop some meditations that would help people to have a space in which they can release their emotional tension and then move into a more traditional space of meditation, sort of combining 2 sections in the meditation. And so that's what I started to do. I created a whole series of meditations about different emotions, about different processes, about different experiences. So I kind of start by talking about a particular area, and then we have a period in the meditation where we really focus on where we're carrying any emotional stress in our body. We release that tension, we release any emotions, and then we move into a more traditional space of stillness and calm. So as I said, it came from my own experience, but there's also a science behind it. I wrote a blog for the HuffPost, which actually talks about what emotional meditation is, with quite a lot of scientific links that really back up why this works.
So let's dive into putting that into practice. We actually have a question from one of our listeners, which feels like a perfect fit for your guidance. So her name is Sherry. She's 46 and lives with her husband and 2 children in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She writes, "In the past couple of years, I have experienced the loss of both family and friends, similar to your experience. These life events have literally dominated my emotional state to the point where grief has crippled my ability to function. How can I work through these types of events quicker and get back to life?"
Well, firstly, I need to just say, Sherry, my heart goes out to you. I can appreciate exactly how challenging that is. Obviously, if she has experienced a significant number of losses of family and friends, she will have a significant amount of grief to process. Now, my feeling about grieving is that it's not so much about working out how we can do it more quickly. It's actually about working out how we can grieve in a way that will allow us to still function. Because grieving is a process and it has to run its course. When I talk to people about bereavement, I liken it to downloading a new program on your computer. It's really interesting. Yesterday, I downloaded a new program on my laptop, and it was quite a big program. So whilst it was downloading and then reconfiguring, basically everything else slowed down completely. And some of the other programs that I normally use on a daily basis stopped working altogether. And I think bereavement is like that. It arrives. We don't choose for it to arrive. It just does. So it's out of our control. And it is a bit like downloading a new program into our internal emotional system, and it's going to run its course whether you like it or not. The key really, I think, is to recognize that and to develop your understanding of what that means, of the different emotional states, and learn how to work with grief in a way that will enable you to still function. It's a bit like the more we understand the process of grieving, the better we can sort of negotiate with it. You know, if you fight grief, it will fight back. You know, we need to learn to work with grief, to be kind to ourselves. And there are certain emotional states that are going to come through this. I mean, I'm finding myself challenged to think how best to support Sherry with this, because there is so much information that I could actually, you know, give her about this. Mm-hmm. In many ways, John, my suggestion would be, as the A to Z of Emotional Health Library goes live in June, there's a whole section on bereavement where I literally talk through all aspects of the emotional journey. Mm-hmm. And there are also meditations very specifically to help with that process of release. Because we need to release our grief, we need to create time in our day so that we can, you know, have periods where we're functioning, but periods when we actually almost like commit ourselves to be able to grieve, to have some time out, to remember the person that we've lost, or indeed the people that we've lost. As I said, the emotional meditations are there to support that process. I would really be encouraging Sherry to try and bring some structure into her life, so she allocates time for grieving, where she sits down, maybe, you know, writes letters to those people, listens to her feelings, allows herself to release those emotions, you know, building memory books about the people that she's lost, but she does it in a structured way. We need structure around our emotions, otherwise we just feel completely overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. Respect what you're feeling.
Absolutely. Respect your emotions. Understand that they are very natural. If we lose someone we love, the intensity of our emotional loss will be relative to the love that we felt for that person. So, you know, in many ways, if you've lost somebody significant and you were sitting here telling me that you weren't feeling something, I'd actually have alarm bells ringing. I'd be thinking, you know, what's wrong with you? You know, are you not human? You know, so these emotions are very, very important to, as you say, to respect, to acknowledge. We then need to really embrace some self-care around this, to recognize our functionality won't be at its best for a while. We've got a big computer program running. There's a lot of reconfiguring to do. So we need to be very kind to ourselves. We need to ask for help and support where we can have that. At the same time, as I said, I'd be allocating time in my day, every day, for either a period of remembering or a period of meditation where I really give myself time out and I'm really supportive and kind to myself. And then I would put a time frame around it, and then I would go and I would do my best and really acknowledge that what I'm doing is maybe not normal for me. I'm not functioning at full capacity, but that's okay. You know, that's really, really okay, because gradually we do regain our normal capacity. It's just that it takes a little while.
Well, thank you for that. I'm certain that Sherry will find that insightful and your guidance very pertinent to her and her life. Let's jump back into your past for just a second. When you were 16, the Chinese Tao Te Ching had a profound effect on you. Share some insights with our listeners on the opening passage and its relationship to your current writings.
Well, it's curious because actually that passage, 30 spokes share the wheel's hub. It is the center hole that makes it useful. Shape clay into a vessel. It's the space within that makes it useful. Cut doors and windows for a room. It's the holes which make it useful. It says profit comes from what is there, usefulness from what is not there. I mean, this passage for me is summarizing the fact that we do actually need structure and boundaries in order to function. I would use this as an analogy for the way in which our mind can collaborate with our emotion, because emotions actually give us meaning in life. They help us to know what matters. You know, a bit like Sherry and the relationships to the people she's lost. Her grief is letting her know how important these people were. But if we have no structure around our emotions, then they can literally overwhelm us. So I think we can work with a collaboration, if you like, between our mind generating structure, but our emotions giving us the information to make us alive feeling people. And for me, this, in a very sort of philosophical and spiritual way, that opening passage actually sums up exactly that. So, as I said, I'm very big on, I think if our mind is too rigid, there is no room for emotional feeling. And then we lack our capacity to be empathic and to develop healthy relationships. But likewise, if we're so emotional and our mind has no control whatsoever, our emotions can run riot and we just become overwhelmed by everything. So there is a real value in developing what I would call mindfulness alongside emotional awareness. I think it's the collaboration of the two that really work.
Terrific. Thank you so much for those insights and how this really affected your teachings going forward. So in addition to your book, 7 Steps to Spiritual Empathy, which is available on Amazon, and the resources that are available on the website, A to Z of emotionalhealth.com, where else can our listeners connect with you, and what else may be on the horizon for Jenny?
Well, there's a lot on the horizon for Jenny actually this year, so it's going to be a very, very terrific year. So the first book, which is all about developing our core relational skills, that was the first in a series all about the intelligence of emotion. So the second book in that series, which is called The Collaboration of Mindfulness with Emotional Awareness, is going to be released later this year. And in that book, I do talk about every single one of our most challenging emotions with really pragmatic tools as to how to turn those emotions into an asset rather than a disability. Mm-hmm. So that's on the horizon. As I said earlier, the A to Z of emotionalhealth.com library is going to become a public resource, a free public resource. So that's going to be launched. And alongside that, we are also launching a monthly free webinar with a live streaming emotional awareness hour. And we will be using that space to talk about all aspects of emotional health in relation to all aspects of our lives. So to join that webinar, people will need to register with their email address. We need to do that to ensure privacy. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, for example, we might be talking about a particular emotion. At other times, we might be talking about parenting or relationships or bereavement. For example, we may talk about suicide. It's Suicide Awareness Day towards the end of the year. Now, if people are going to feel free to ask the right questions, to share elements of themselves that may be difficult and challenging, we need them to also have a degree of privacy and anonymity. So we'll be setting up the Emotional Awareness Hour. You'll need to log on through an email address with a username, and that means that you can join the conversation without having to necessarily expose yourself if you're wanting to talk about something that's particularly vulnerable to you. Mm-hmm. So that will be launched in June as well, alongside the A to Z of Emotional Health website going live as a free resource. And that will be available on a monthly basis for people to connect in, to log into, to join the conversation, but also we'll record it. So if you miss one, you can then listen to it afterwards as well.
Wow, that all sounds very exciting, and we're all looking forward to the release of your next book. So thank you, Jenny, for such an insightful conversation. It's really been a delight to have you as our guest on the Emotions Matter podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute delight to speak with you, John. It really has. Thank you.
Again, you can connect with Jenny at jennyflorencehealth.com, all one word, jennyflorencehealth.com, or at her audio library, which is available on the web at a-z-of-emotionalhealth.com. Again, it's a-z-of-emotionalhealth.com. This is John, and I want to thank you for joining me on another episode of the Emotions Matter podcast.